Connor Banks rubbed his temples as he stepped off the interstellar cruiser, exhaustion etched deep across his face. The voyage from Earth to Polaris Prime had been grueling, with the relentless hum of the ship's engines and the starkly alien accommodations offering little in the way of comfort. While he couldn't deny the thrill of his achievement, winning a prestigious intergalactic engineering fellowship, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the fine print had proved daunting. It had outlined a rigorous program, interspecies collaboration requirements, and an overwhelming emphasis on cultural exchange. He had skimmed over most of it, his focus fixed on the promise of working on groundbreaking projects and the allure of the unknown. Now, as he stepped into Polaris Prime's bustling terminal, the sheer sensory overload hit him like a tidal wave. The terminal was a dazzling mosaic of species and sounds. Feathered beings squawked in rhythmic harmony, their vibrant plumage shimmering under artificial lights. Gelatinous entities pulsed and glowed like living lava lamps, their movements hypnotically fluid. Towering reptilian creatures strode past with surprising grace, their scaled tails sweeping behind them in elegant arcs. Connor marveled at the spectacle, momentarily distracted from his fatigue. He caught himself staring at a group of insectoid beings communicating through a series of rapid clicks and light pulses from their antennae. It was as fascinating as it was surreal. His communicator chimed, pulling him from his reverie. A blinking text displayed his room assignment. Delta Sector, Habitat Suite 13. Connor sighed, shouldering his travel pack and following the glowing signs that guided him through corridors that shimmered as though alive. The walls shifted hues in response to the proximity of passers-by, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. He couldn't help but admire the station's design, which blended advanced engineering with an organic aesthetic. When he finally reached Suite 13, Connor was ready to collapse. He imagined tranquility, a soft bed, perhaps a holographic entertainment unit to help him unwind. Instead, as the door slid open with a soft hiss, he froze mid-step. A figure lounged casually on the expansive bed, their lavender skin catching the room's ambient glow. She, at least Connor assumed she was female, was distinctly alien, yet her appearance was strikingly human-like. Her silver eyes sparkled with curiosity as they locked onto him, and her hair, a cascade of what looked like liquid mercury, shimmered with every slight movement. She wore an outfit that seemed to ripple in sync with her gestures, a testament to alien fashion Connor couldn't even begin to comprehend. The air of confidence she exuded was disarming, and for a moment Connor simply stared, his brain scrambling to process the unexpected scene. "You're late," she said finally, her voice melodious yet tinged with impatience. Connor blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Who are you?" he stammered, his exhaustion evaporating in the face of confusion. The alien woman sat up with fluid grace, extending a hand adorned with intricate metallic tattoos that gleamed faintly in the light. "My name's Xena," she said smoothly. "Diplomatic envoy from the Arsalis cluster. Pleased to meet you, roommate." "Roommate?" Connor's voice cracked on the word. This has to be a mistake. I'm supposed to have this suite to myself?" Xena arched an elegant eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "It's no mistake, Earthling. Haven't you read the Galactic Fellowship Charter? Interspecies cohabitation is mandatory for cultural exchange. Sharing quarters fosters understanding." Connor groaned, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't read the charter past the acceptance page. "Can't you? I don't know, request another room?" Xena smirked, reclining back onto the bed with a casual elegance that grated on Connor's nerves. "Fully booked," she said breezily. "The Nebula Festival attracts half the galaxy. It's you and me, pal." Her nonchalance only heightened his frustration. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the sleek couch by the wall. "I'll take the sofa." Xena's silver eyes widened and she gasped theatrically. "That would be deeply insulting where I'm from," she declared, sitting upright. "Sharing a bed is an essential part of our customs. It symbolizes trust and unity." Connor felt his face flush. "We're not on Arsalis, are we?" "No," she replied, her expression turning mischievous. "But wouldn't you want to respect my culture? It's diplomatic." Her playful tone grated against his fraying patience, but he saw no way out of the predicament. "We'll sort this out tomorrow," he mumbled, already dreading the conversation with the station's administration. Connor woke the next morning to an unusual sensation, a subtle vibration in the air and the faint scent of something sweet and spicy. Blinking groggily, he squinted toward the window. Xena was perched on the sill, her silhouette framed against the cosmic view of the nebula outside. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She turned her head, her expression serene. Admiring the nebula, she said simply. Your planet has nothing like it, I assume? Connor yawned, sitting up. We've got beauty, he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Just, not this. Xena's silvery laughter filled the room. Fair enough. Hungry? I ordered breakfast, a mix of human and Arcelus cuisine. Connor eyed the tray on the table with skepticism. Among the offerings, he recognized toast, but it was flanked by what looked like glowing jellyfish tentacles. Xena plucked one from the plate and popped it into her mouth, grinning. Try it, she said. It's delicious. He hesitated, finally opting for a piece of toast. Thanks, but I'll stick to what I know. As they ate, Xena bombarded him with questions about Earth. Despite his attempts to steer the conversation toward neutral topics, she had a knack for veering into personal territory. So, she said slyly, anyone special back home? Connor nearly choked on his toast. What? You know, she said, leaning forward, her silver eyes glinting with amusement. Someone waiting for you? No, he said quickly, focusing intently on his plate. Interesting, she mused, her gaze lingering on him. The day unfolded with an awkward tension as they explored the station together. Despite his reservations, Connor couldn't deny Xena's charm or her ability to turn heads wherever they went. Beings of all species stopped to greet her, clearly impressed by her presence. By the time they returned to their suite, Connor felt both exhausted and bewildered. Xena stretched out on the bed, patting the space beside her. Come on, roommate. Time for bed. Connor groaned. Do you ever quit? Her laughter was his only answer. As Connor lay stiffly on the farthest edge of the bed, clutching a pillow like a lifeline, he muttered under his breath, This is ridiculous. You say something, roommate? Xena's voice, soft yet teasing, cut through the dark. Just wondering how I got roped into this, he mumbled. Xena rolled onto her side, her glowing tattoos casting faint patterns on the walls. You Earthlings are so quick to resist the unknown, she said. Back home, life is a dance of unexpected partnerships. A shared bed is the least of it. Connor opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. There was something disarming about her words. Finally he sighed. Good night, Xena. Sweet dreams, Connor, she replied, her tone softer than before. The quiet hum of the station seemed louder than usual as Connor stirred from a restless sleep. He blinked, disoriented in the dim light, and shifted under the blanket he had tossed over himself during the night. Something had stirred him awake, though he wasn't sure what. His heart was racing, his instincts prickling with unease. The faint, familiar thrum of the station's systems filled the silence, but beneath it there was something else. Something off. Connor sat up, glancing around the room. The faint glow from the nebula outside illuminated the space in shades of blue and silver. Xena's side of the bed was empty. For a moment he thought she might have simply gotten up early, but the eerie stillness in the room suggested otherwise. Xena? He called out, his voice rough with sleep. There was no response. Swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, Connor rubbed his eyes and sighed. His gaze fell on the suite door, which was slightly ajar. That wasn't right. He distinctly remembered it being closed before he'd gone to bed. A soft light spilt into the room from the hallway beyond, its glow unsettling in the quiet. Connor rose, grabbing his jacket and pulling it on over his sleep clothes. The fabric felt cool against his skin as he stepped toward the door, his movements cautious. Peering out into the hallway, he found it eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity conspicuously absent. The corridors of Polaris Prime were never silent, not even in the dead of night. A low sense of dread began to settle in his chest. Xena? He called again, louder this time. His voice echoed faintly down the long, curving hallway. Still no answer. Driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, Connor stepped into the corridor. The soft, ambient lighting bathed the sleek metallic walls in a cold, sterile glow, and the distant hum of the station felt almost muted. Up ahead, he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting around a corner. His breath hitched, and he hesitated for a moment before taking a tentative step forward. Xena? He tried again, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. The shadow didn't respond. Connor's pulse quickened as he followed, his bare feet making soft sounds against the smooth flooring. Each turn led him deeper into unfamiliar territory. The walls here felt different, colder, darker. The usual elegant curves of Polaris Prime's architecture were replaced by sharper angles and a more utilitarian design. He hadn't seen this part of the station before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Connor emerged into a large observation deck. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching as his eyes adjusted to the sudden openness. The space was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across one side, revealing the swirling majesty of the nebula outside. Colors shifted and danced in mesmerizing patterns, their ethereal glow casting the room in an otherworldly light. In the center of the deck stood Xena. She was facing the windows, her back to him, and her stance was both statuesque and unnervingly still. Her silver hair shimmered faintly in the nebula's light, cascading over her shoulders like liquid metal. The intricate tattoos on her arms glowed faintly, their patterns pulsing in rhythm with an unseen beat. The air around her shimmered as if caught in a heat wave, distorting her outlines slightly. "Xena," Connor said, his voice softer now though no less urgent. She didn't respond. He stepped closer, the faint sound of his approach finally drawing her attention. Slowly she turned to face him, her luminous silver eyes meeting his. There was a calm intensity in her gaze, and for a moment, Connor felt as though she was looking straight through him, seeing something he couldn't comprehend. "You shouldn't be here, Connor," she said, her voice melodic but tinged with an edge he hadn't heard before. "I woke up and you were gone," he said, his words tumbling out. The door was open. "What's going on?" Xena tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I needed space to think," she said after a pause. "To connect." "Connect?" Connor repeated, his brow furrowing. She gestured vaguely toward the nebula outside. "It's hard to explain in your terms. For my people, being near such phenomena, it's grounding. The energy here, it speaks to us. Calms the mind. Centers the soul." Connor glanced at the swirling colors outside, their beauty undeniable. But there was something about Xena's demeanor that unsettled him. Her usual playful charm was replaced with a solemnity he hadn't seen before. "You could have said something," he said, his voice softening. "You had me thinking something happened to you." A flicker of guilt crossed her face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I didn't mean to worry you," she said, her tone gentler now. Connor hesitated before stepping closer, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" Xena smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said. "Just recalibrating?" "Recalibrating," he echoed, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. "For my people, emotions are deeply tied to energy," she explained. "When I'm overwhelmed, I need to realign, find balance. The nebula helps." Connor crossed his arms, unsure whether to be reassured or more concerned. "And you couldn't do that back in the suite?" Xena chuckled softly, the sound lighter now. "Not with you snoring like that." Connor felt a flush creep up his neck. "I don't snore." Her grin widened. "You do, but it's endearing. Like a small, earthbound creature trying to breathe through its nose." Despite himself, Connor couldn't help but laugh, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Okay, point taken." Xena turned back toward the windows, her expression softening as she gazed out at the nebula. "I envy you sometimes, you know," she said after a moment. Connor blinked, surprised. "Me? Why?" "You Earthlings," she said, her tone thoughtful. "You experience everything so sharply. You feel deeply even when it's messy or painful. For my kind, emotions are more controlled, more deliberate. It's efficient, but sometimes I wonder what it's like to live with that kind of chaos." Connor stepped up beside her, following her gaze. The nebula's colors reflected faintly in the glass, painting their faces in hues of blue and violet. "Chaos isn't all it's cracked up to be," he said with a wry smile. Xena glanced at him, her silver eyes shimmering. "Maybe not. But there's beauty in it too." They stood in silence for a moment, the nebula's light filling the room. Connor felt a strange sense of calm, despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Xena," he said finally, his voice quiet, "if you ever need space like this again, just tell me, okay?" She nodded, her expression softening. "I will. Thank you." For the first time since waking up, Connor felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. Whatever Xena's rituals or customs were, he realized they were as much a part of her as his own habits were to him. Maybe this interspecies cohabitation wasn't just about understanding each other's cultures. It was about finding common ground in their differences. As they turned to leave the observation deck, Xena paused, her playful smirk returning. "By the way," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "you still owe me an explanation for that snoring." Connor groaned, rolling his eyes. "You're never letting that go, are you?" "Not a chance, roommate," she replied, her laughter echoing softly through the quiet corridors as they made their way back to the suite. The vibrant, almost hypnotic glow of the nebula outside the observation deck was now a menacing swirl of chaos. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy, and the air felt heavy, thick with tension. Xena's usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced with urgency and a trace of fear that Connor had never seen before. He barely had time to think, let alone breathe, as alarms blared throughout the station, drowning out the distant hum of its systems. Connor's mind raced, the enormity of the situation crashing over him like a tidal wave. A rift? A tear in spacetime? And something ancient waking up within it? He'd signed up for an engineering fellowship, not a front-row seat to what felt like the prelude to an intergalactic catastrophe. His stomach churned as Xena gripped his arm, her silver eyes now sharp and focused. "We need to move now," she said, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and automated warnings. "Move where?" he asked, stumbling as she pulled him into the corridor. "To the central hub," she replied, not breaking stride. "If we're lucky, we can stabilize the rift long enough to evacuate the station. But we don't have much time." They sprinted down the hallway, which was now alive with chaos. Beings of every shape and size poured from their rooms, their faces painted with fear and confusion. The sleek, shimmering corridors of Polaris Prime, once a testament to intergalactic unity and technological prowess, were now littered with debris. Overhead, the lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that only heightened the sense of dread. "Stay close," Xena instructed, tightening her grip on his arm. "Not a problem," Connor muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. As they rounded a corner, a group of heavily armed security officers rushed past, their expressions grim. They barely spared a glance at Connor and Xena, their focus entirely on the task ahead. The station shuddered beneath their feet, and a deep, resonating hum seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Connor felt the vibration in his bones, a sensation both alien and unnerving. "What's happening?" he asked, struggling to keep up with Xena's pace. "The rift's energy is destabilizing the station," Xena said without looking back. "If we don't act fast, it'll tear this place apart." Back in their suite, Xena moved with practiced efficiency, opening a concealed panel in the wall to reveal an array of alien devices. She strapped a sleek, metallic band around her wrist, its surface glowing faintly as it powered up. Turning to Connor, she tossed him a small, circular gadget. "Put this on," she said. "What is it?" he asked, catching it awkwardly. "Emergency beacon," she replied. "If we get separated, it'll guide you to safety." Connor fumbled with the device, securing it to his wrist. The faint hum of its activation did little to ease his nerves. "And what happens if we don't get separated?" "Then you stick with me," Xena said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We're in this together." Connor nodded, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in his throat. "What's the plan?" Xena glanced out the window, her expression grim. "First we get to the central hub. If we can recalibrate the stabilizers, we might be able to contain the rift's energy." "Might doesn't sound very reassuring," Connor muttered. "It's the best we've got," Xena shot back. "Now let's move." The journey to the central hub was a gauntlet of chaos. Smoke hung thick in the air, the acrid smell stinging Connor's nose and throat. The station's corridors, once pristine and orderly, were now a maze of destruction. Beings of all species surged past them, their panic palpable. Shouts and cries filled the air, a cacophony of fear and desperation. Connor's eyes darted around, trying to process the chaos while keeping pace with Xena. As they neared the hub, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that made Connor's skin crawl. The walls pulsed faintly, as though the station itself were alive and straining against the rift's energy. "This is bad," Xena muttered, her pace quickening. Inside the central hub, the scene was even more dire. Scientists and engineers worked frantically at their stations, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of urgency. At the center of the room, a massive holographic display showed the rift, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to defy logic. The vibrant colors of the nebula outside now appeared hostile, a volatile storm on the brink of consuming everything in its path. Xena approached a towering alien with multiple eyes, who appeared to be the lead scientist. "What's the status?" she demanded. "It's unstable," the alien replied, his voice strained. "The containment field is failing. We've got minutes, maybe less." Xena's jaw tightened as she turned to Connor. "Stay here," she said firmly. "No way," he protested. "I can help." "Connor," she interrupted, her tone resolute. "I need you to trust me. If this goes wrong," she didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of her words was clear. Connor hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to argue, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. "I trust you," he said quietly. Xena nodded, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her grim expression. Then she turned and dove into the chaos of the control panels, barking orders to the technicians around her. Connor stayed near the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt useless, an observer in a crisis he barely understood. His gaze was drawn to the holographic display at the center of the room. The rift was growing more unstable by the second, its swirling vortex now a chaotic dance of energy that seemed to reach out, as though alive. The station shuddered violently, knocking Connor off balance. He grabbed onto a nearby console for support, his eyes darting to Xena. She was working furiously at the controls, her fingers flying over alien symbols he couldn't begin to decipher. Around her, engineers shouted orders in a dozen different languages, their collective panic palpable. "If we can recalibrate the stabilizers," Xena called out, her voice cutting through the din, "we might buy enough time to evacuate the station." "Might?" Connor muttered under his breath. Xena glanced back at him, her silver eyes flashing with resolve. "It's better than nothing." Connor straightened, his fear giving way to a surge of determination. He might not understand the alien technology or the science behind the rift, but he knew one thing. Xena needed him to stay grounded, to be a steady presence in the chaos. The hub's energy crackled with an almost sentient force, a reminder of the rift's power. As Xena continued to work, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whatever lay at the heart of the rift, it was waking up, and it wasn't going to wait for them to figure out a solution. "Xena," he called out, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "Whatever happens, we're getting out of this. Together." She glanced back at him, her expression softening for a brief moment. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Earthling," she said with a faint smile before turning back to the controls. Connor clenched his fists, bracing himself for whatever came next. The station shuddered again, and he felt the full weight of the moment bearing down on him. There was no turning back now. Whatever this ancient presence was, it was here, and their fight for survival had just begun. The station trembled violently, sending a cascade of sparks from the walls and throwing everyone off balance. Connor slammed into a nearby console, wincing as pain shot through his side. Around him, chaos erupted. Engineers scrambled to stabilize failing systems, alarms blared in an overlapping cacophony, and an eerie, guttural roar, a sound so deep it felt as though it originated in the bones of the station itself, rattled through the central hub. "What the hell was that?" Connor shouted, his voice barely cutting through the noise. Xena's face paled as she fixed her gaze on the holographic display in the center of the room. The swirling vortex of the rift now showed something emerging, something vast and unfathomable. Its form was in constant flux, a mass of light and shadow, tendrils spiraling outward as if testing the boundaries of reality. Connor felt a chill run down his spine. The creature wasn't just breaching the rift, it was imposing itself on their dimension. The lead scientist, his many eyes wide with panic, turned to Xena. "It's attempting to manifest. If it breaches fully, it will consume everything within light years." Xena's jaw tightened as she keyed a rapid sequence into the console in front of her. "Divert all auxiliary power to the containment field," she barked. The scientist hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "That could destabilize the station entirely. It's that or annihilation." Xena snapped, her voice cutting like a blade. Connor felt utterly out of his depth. His heart raced as the hub descended into an even deeper state of chaos. He wasn't a scientist or a soldier. What could he possibly do here? But standing idle as an eldritch monstrosity clawed its way into existence wasn't an option either. "Tell me what to do," he said, stepping up beside Xena. Her silver eyes flicked toward him, momentarily surprised before softening. She nodded quickly, her fingers flying over the console. "The manual stabilizer controls are on the upper deck," she said. "You'll need to crank the levers in sequence to reinforce the containment field. One at a time." Blue sequence. Connor followed her gaze to the ladder leading to the upper deck. It trembled ominously with every quake. "Got it," he said, swallowing his fear. Grabbing the ladder, Connor began the climb, each rung vibrating under his weight. The station groaned around him, and the distant roar of the entity grew louder. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he finally pulled himself onto the upper deck. Before him stretched a line of massive, glowing levers, their surfaces inscribed with alien symbols he couldn't hope to understand. "Xena," he shouted down, panic creeping into his voice. "Which ones?" Her voice crackled through the emergency beacon strapped to his wrist. "Follow the blue sequence. One at a time, Connor, and hurry." He scanned the levers, spotting the faintly glowing blue markings that distinguished the correct sequence. His hands trembled as he grasped the first lever. The metal was warm to the touch, humming faintly with the same energy that seemed to saturate the air. Bracing himself, Connor pulled with all his strength. The lever resisted as though alive, before finally locking into place with a satisfying clang. The station shuddered again, but the vibrations lessened slightly, as if the first lever had managed to steady its foundations. Below, the holographic projection of the rift flickered, the containment field glowing brighter around its edges. Next. Xena's voice urged through the beacon. Connor moved to the second lever, his breath coming in short gasps. The pull was even harder this time, his muscles straining against the mechanism's resistance. He felt something in his shoulder twinge painfully as the lever finally clicked into place. Sweat dripped down his face as he approached the third lever. His movements grew slower, his body protesting with each pull. The containment field continued to strengthen, but it was clear the rift wasn't giving up. A tendril of shadow erupted through the field, snaking toward the hub below. "Xena!" Connor shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "It's breaching again?" Below, Xena stared at the encroaching tendril, her mind racing. She grabbed a small, cylindrical device from the console, its faint glow catching Connor's attention. "What's that?" the lead scientist asked, his voice trembling. "A containment grenade," Xena replied grimly. "It'll buy us a few seconds if I can deploy it directly into the rift." "That's suicide," the scientist protested, his many eyes narrowing in disbelief. Xena ignored him, clutching the device tightly. She glanced up at Connor. "Keep pulling those levers." Connor's heart pounded as he watched her step toward the projection of the rift, its tendrils thrashing violently. He yanked another lever into place, the strain nearly dislocating his shoulder. "Xena, don't," he shouted. She turned to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Trust me." Before he could argue, she activated the grenade and hurled it toward the rift's projection. The device detonated with a blinding flash of light, temporarily forcing the entity to recoil. Its amorphous form writhed in pain, destabilizing for a moment. "Now, Connor." Xena's voice rang out. "The last lever." Adrenaline surged through him as he sprinted to the final lever, his vision blurring with sweat and exhaustion. Gripping the warm, pulsing metal, he pulled with everything he had. The mechanism groaned in protest, its resistance nearly overwhelming, but Connor refused to let go. With one final, desperate effort, the lever locked into place. Below, the containment field surged with new energy, its glow intensifying until it enveloped the rift completely. The entity let out a deafening shriek, its tendrils dissolving into nothingness as the field forced it back into its dimensional prison. The swirling vortex of the rift stabilized, its violent energy calming into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The room fell silent except for the labored breathing of everyone inside. The alarms had stopped, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Connor slid down the ladder, his legs trembling and his hands shaking uncontrollably. Xena stood near the console, her shoulders slumped from exhaustion. Her silver eyes, however, still burnt with determination. "We did it," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Connor nodded, his relief tempered by the ache in his body. "You're insane, you know that?" A tired smile played at her lips. "Maybe," she admitted, "but it worked." Around them, the crew erupted into cheers, their terror giving way to elation. The danger had passed, at least for now. As the cheers faded into the background, Connor leaned against a wall, catching his breath. His muscles ached, and his heart was still racing, but a quiet sense of triumph began to settle in. Xena approached him, her usual confidence tinged with exhaustion. "Not bad for your first galactic crisis," she quipped, though her voice lacked its usual playfulness. Connor managed a dry laugh, meeting her gaze. "Not bad? I think I just aged 10 years. Welcome to the club," she replied, her smile widening slightly. In the chaos of the rift, they had forged something unspoken, a bond forged in fire, tempered by trust. Whatever came next, Connor realized they would face it together. Xena's expression softened just a fraction as Connor's words hung in the air between them. "You're stubborn," she said, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "Comes with being human," he replied with a shrug, feeling the weight of his decision press down on him. He had no training for something like this, no experience to fall back on. But that didn't matter right now. Xena had proven time and again that she was more than capable, but Connor couldn't stand by and let her face the rift alone. Not when everything he had learned about her in the past few days told him that she would do exactly that, face it alone, without hesitation, without a second thought. The preparations for the mission were swift. There was no time to waste. Xena and Connor were each outfitted with reinforced suits, designed to withstand the chaotic environment of the rift. The suits were equipped with technology meant to help them navigate the gravitational distortions, but Connor knew there was no guarantee they would work as expected. The crew gathered around them, offering a mix of hopeful looks and worried frowns. Connor's heart pounded as he gazed at the rift, its swirling vortex hypnotic and menacing in equal measure. The colors inside the rift shifted constantly, bleeding into one another in a maddening dance of vibrant hues. The air felt thick with something unspoken, a tension that wrapped itself around him like a vice. He glanced at Xena, who was already preparing herself for the mission, her face set with the same determination she had shown in every crisis they had faced together. "You ready?" Xena's voice cut through his thoughts, steady and calm despite the storm they were about to step into. "Not even a little," Connor admitted, his voice tight with anxiety. She chuckled softly, and for a brief moment, he almost thought he saw a flicker of something lighter in her expression. "You'll do fine," she said, though her tone was less sure than usual. The crew watched them as they activated their suits, a final moment of silence hanging over them before Xena and Connor stepped onto the platform overlooking the rift. The ground beneath them seemed to vibrate, as though it too could feel the growing instability of the rift. Connor fought to keep his balance, his body tense, every nerve on high alert as they prepared to plunge into the unknown. With one last look at the crew, Connor turned to Xena, his jaw tight. "Let's do this." Together they stepped into the vortex. The world twisted around Connor as he was pulled in all directions at once. Gravity bent and warped, pulling him toward one direction then another. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled, and he was trapped within it, unable to make sense of the shifting chaos around him. The colors of the rift bled and fused together, creating new hues that were both beautiful and terrifying in their complexity. Time itself seemed to stretch as if it no longer existed in a linear fashion. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet moments passed in a blink. "Stay close," Xena's voice crackled through his comms, a reminder of the thin thread that connected them in this disorienting place. "I'm right behind you," he called back, his voice rough with the effort to concentrate on the unstable ground beneath him. Every step was a challenge. The very air seemed to shift around them, and Connor could feel the pull of the rift, like a hand grabbing at his body, trying to drag him further into its heart. The core of the rift loomed ahead, an immense mass of pulsating energy that seemed both alive and malevolent. It was the heart of the rift, the source of its power. The closer they got, the more dangerous it felt. Tendrils of energy lashed out from the core, snapping at the space around them, as though it recognized the intrusion and was fighting back. Each tendril was a violent burst of power, and they pulsed with a strange kind of rhythm, as though the rift itself was breathing. Xena stepped forward, cradling the sealing device in her hands, the compact sphere humming with energy. It was their only chance to neutralize the rift permanently. She glanced at Connor, her gaze hard and resolute. "Once I activate the seal, we have seconds to get out. No room for mistakes." Connor nodded, his heart racing in his chest. "Then let's not waste any time." As Xena prepared to deploy the device, the rift seemed to react. A tendril shot out, faster than either of them could react, and struck Xena's suit. She was thrown backward by the force of the blow, her body slamming into the jagged, shifting terrain of the rift. Connor's breath caught in his throat as he rushed to her side. "Xena." His voice was sharp with fear. She groaned, trying to sit up, and Connor helped her to her feet. Her suit had absorbed most of the impact, but he could see the faint scorch marks where the energy had made contact. She looked dazed but otherwise unharmed. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice shaky but determined. "Just disoriented. Keep moving." Connor glanced nervously at the core of the rift. The tendrils were growing more aggressive now, lashing out with increasing frequency. They had to hurry, or they would be swallowed whole by the rift's chaotic energy. "Xena, we need to go now," Connor urged, his voice tight with urgency. Xena's eyes met his for a moment and she nodded. Despite the chaos, despite the growing danger, there was a calmness in her expression, as if she had already accepted the risks. "You ready?" "No, but I'll follow you anywhere," Connor said, his voice low but steady. Together they moved toward the core and Xena activated the sealing device. The compact sphere crackled with energy, its surface glowing brighter as it hummed with power. Connor felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly dashed as the rift responded, its tendrils snapping and twisting, now even more aggressive than before. The core pulsed wildly as though reacting to the disruption. "Now?" Xena shouted, her voice filled with urgency. With one final, desperate movement, Xena hurled the device into the center of the rift. It detonated with a brilliant flash of light, and for a moment the tendrils of energy recoiled. The rift seemed to falter, as though it was unsure of what had just happened. But Connor didn't have time to celebrate. A tendril lashed out again, this time aiming directly at them. It was faster than before, and its energy crackled with destructive force. "Xena, move!" Connor shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her away just as the tendril struck the ground where they had been standing moments before. They ran, the unstable ground beneath them shifting with every step, but the energy of the rift was starting to stabilize. The vibrations were lessening, and the chaotic pull of the rift was weakening. They were running out of time. The core had been sealed, but there was still the risk that the rift could reopen. "Connor, we need to get out of here now." Xena's voice was tight with urgency. "On it," he shouted back. Together they sprinted toward the edge of the rift, the world around them shifting and distorting. The vortex was no longer the overwhelming presence it had once been, but they couldn't afford to take chances. As they reached the exit, the rift's presence finally began to recede, its violent energy fading into a steady pulse. Connor took one last look back at the rift's turbulent core. They had done it, at least for now. But the dangers of the rift weren't over. Not yet. And as they made their way back to the station, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Xena's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and insistent. "There's no time," she said, her hands pushing the sealing device into Connor's grasp. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering, as though there was no room for debate. "You'll have to do it?" Connor's mind raced, every instinct screaming in protest. The idea of leaving Xena behind, of not facing this disaster together, was impossible. "No way," he said immediately, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you here." Xena's expression remained stern and unflinching as the roar of the rift grew louder. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a constant reminder of how little time they had left. "You have to," she insisted, her voice firm and resolute. "If we both stay, neither of us will make it out." The rift's core pulsed with increasing intensity. The energy within it was nearing a fever pitch, the surrounding space warping violently as the rift continued to tear at the very fabric of reality. Connor felt the force of it deep in his bones, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. But Xena was right. Every moment they hesitated brought them closer to oblivion. The rift would consume everything and there would be no second chances. Connor's hands tightened around the device, the weight of it feeling impossibly heavy. His mind locked into a singular focus as the chaos around him seemed to blur into the background. "Then we both go," he said, his voice filled with finality. Xena opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, he was already moving, pulling her along with him. Together, they sprinted toward the heart of the rift, where the sealing device would be their last hope. Every step was a struggle as the ground beneath them cracked and shifted, threatening to swallow them whole. The rift convulsed violently as they approached, its core thrumming with raw, uncontained energy. The space around them seemed to collapse in on itself, twisting and warping, pulling in all directions. Time itself felt distorted, and every movement felt like it was happening in slow motion, as though they were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an endless void. Xena and Connor reached the center of the core, and with a single, synchronized motion they activated the seal. The device thrummed to life, sending a pulse of energy into the rift's core. The rift's chaotic energy spiraled inward, the vortex twisting and warping as the sealing device began to stabilize it. The very space around them began to settle, but not without a violent fight. The rift resisted, its energy flaring up one last time in an attempt to tear everything apart. "It's working," Xena shouted over the deafening roar of the collapsing dimensions, her voice filled with both triumph and urgency. Connor's heart raced as he held onto Xena, his grip tightening around her arm. The ground beneath them was cracking apart, shards of glowing energy shooting upward as the rift's collapse continued. The tremors shook them and every surface around them seemed to fracture and dissolve into nothingness. It was a race against time now, get out or be swallowed whole by the rift's implosion. "Great," Connor muttered, half sarcastic, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of an escape. "Now how do we get out of here?" Xena's eyes darted around the collapsing space, her mind working at lightning speed. She scanned their surroundings, her focus intense as she searched for any sign of hope. Then, just as the space around them began to collapse into a swirling mess of energy, she spotted it. A portal, faint but discernible, hovering in the distance. "There," she shouted, pointing. "That's our way out." Connor's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and determination as he glanced at the portal. It was their only chance and it felt like they were running out of time. The rift was imploding behind them, and the ground beneath their feet was crumbling into nothingness. The platforms they had been standing on had already begun to dissolve into the chaotic space, leaving only a few unstable footholds in their path. They had to move fast. With no time to waste, they took off, sprinting toward the portal. The ground beneath them shifted unpredictably, forming and dissolving in the blink of an eye. Every step felt like a gamble. One misstep and they would be lost to the rift forever. Behind them, the implosion of the rift's core intensified, sending shockwaves rippling through the space. The noise was deafening, a constant barrage of distorted sounds as the rift reached the final stages of its collapse. Connor's breath caught in his throat as a platform beneath him cracked apart, sending him stumbling. He barely caught himself on the edge of another fragment, his heart racing as he fought to stay balanced. The energy of the rift seemed to reach for him, pulling him into its collapsing maw. "Connor?" Xena's voice pierced through the noise as she reached back, her strong hand grabbing his arm and pulling him up with surprising strength. "Thanks," he gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were shaking from the effort, but there was no time to rest. "Don't thank me yet," Xena barked, her tone clipped and focused. "Move." Without missing a beat, they pushed forward, each leap taking them closer to the portal. But just as they neared it, disaster struck. A massive tendril of energy shot out from the collapsing core, striking the path ahead and shattering it into fragments. The gap between them and the portal widened impossibly, and Connor's stomach sank. Xena skidded to a halt, her eyes scanning the space in front of them. "What now?" Connor asked, his voice hoarse with exertion and frustration. Xena's gaze hardened, her mind working furiously to find a solution. She turned to him with a resolve that made his heart skip a beat. "There's only one way," she said, her voice steady. Before Connor could react, Xena grabbed the grappling line from her suit, anchoring it to the edge of the nearest platform. "I'll swing you across," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "No way." Connor protested, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You'll be stuck here?" "I'll figure it out," Xena replied, a flicker of her usual confidence returning. "Just trust me." Connor hesitated, torn between his instincts and the urgency of the situation. The rift's collapse was rapidly accelerating, and every second counted. Finally he nodded, a grim resolve settling over him. "You better not get yourself killed." Xena flashed him a small, reassuring smile before she gave him a powerful push, sending him swinging across the chasm. Connor's stomach flipped as he sailed through the air, his heart in his throat. He landed unsteadily on the other side, his legs nearly buckling beneath him from the force of the landing. He turned just in time to see Xena brace herself against another shockwave. The platform beneath her began to crumble, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like she might fall. But then out of nowhere, a drone appeared, piloted by the station's rescue team. The drone extended its arms and latched onto Xena, lifting her from the crumbling platform and pulling her into the air. Connor let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as Xena was carried toward him. She landed beside him, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of relief and humor. "Miss me?" she asked with a smirk, clearly unbothered by the chaos they had just survived. "Don't push your luck," Connor replied, though his relief was evident in the way he gripped her shoulder. Together, they leaped through the portal just as the rift collapsed entirely, sealing itself in a burst of brilliant light. The sensation of re-entering normal space was jarring, but as they materialized back on the station, the sight of the familiar corridors brought a wave of overwhelming relief. A cheer erupted from the crew as they surrounded them, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude. The lead scientist approached them, bowing deeply. "You've saved not only the station but potentially the entire sector," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Words cannot express our gratitude." Later, as Xena and Connor sat in the quiet of their suite, the weight of the ordeal finally started to settle. Xena turned to Connor, her expression softening. "You didn't have to come with me, you know." Connor smirked, leaning back in his chair, exhausted but content. "And let you hog all the glory? No chance." Xena laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the room. "You humans really are something else." Connor raised his glass of glowing alien drink, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're stubborn, reckless and maybe a little insane," he said, "but we get the job done." Xena raised her glass to him, a look of mutual respect in her eyes. "To stubborn, reckless humans," she said, and their glasses clinked together in a quiet, shared moment of victory. As the station settled back into normalcy, Xena and Connor found themselves hailed as heroes. Their resilience, their strength, and their growing partnership had saved the day. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: wherever the galaxy took them next, they would face it together.